So I apologize. Michael Strong, who was slated to be speaking here, he's down in Honduras right now. Just a few days ago, last week, they passed a new legislative hurdle for the Free Cities Initiative. Sorry, and so he couldn't be here. I'm going to do my best to present the Free Cities Initiative, although I am also a Free Stater. I'll be moving here by the end of this year. Thank you. I've been paying attention to both the Free Cities Initiative and also other projects like the seasteading movement, all of which, including the Free State Project, are interesting initiatives because they all try to answer the question, where do you go to get better laws? And we've heard David Friedman and some others talk about very different legal systems and competitive legal systems. And the big question, of course, is how can we actually implement that in our lifetimes, to borrow a phrase. And there's, of course, the Free State Project, what we're doing here. We're burdened by well, before I do that, let me get into what exactly is the Free Cities Project. So this concept of a charter city, and this has been implemented a few times in history. There are plenty of Middle Ages sort of Renaissance examples, but in the modern age, one of the better known examples is, of course, Hong Kong, which existed as a sort of special economic zone inside of China, but run by the British. And they, of course, have been wildly successful. More recently, right across the water from Hong Kong was Shenzhen. And Shenzhen in 1980 was turned into a special economic zone. Again, low regulation, low taxes, that sort of thing. And now hosts something like 14 million people and is responsible for a huge chunk of global manufacturing. And Dubai is another example that people know, the Las Vegas of the Middle East. It was basically desert in 2004. And they took 110 acres and transitioned it from Sharia law to British common law. And it's now the financial hub of the Middle East. So there have been a couple of people who have been thinking about the whole Charter Cities project and how to implement it in a more widespread fashion. And Paul Romer has been thinking about charter cities a lot, and he had a TED Talk in 2009 where he basically presented the idea and proposed a couple of different places that might be interested in that, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. And there was a Honduran government minister named Octavio Sanchez who saw this TED Talk online and thought, wow, that's a great idea. Presented it up to his, to his boss, president, and it just happened to be the right idea at the right time. It caught on. They said they saw the genius of carving out a small piece of land and trying to give it an economic boost, and they saw how that would benefit not just the investors but also the entire country. And so they actually got it passed through the legislature. And so there's a lot of buzz and excitement, and then the Supreme Court struck it down. And nobody's totally sure of what all went into that, but probably a lot of it had to do with internal politics. And then, of course, there was a coup, and things got a little dicey there. But the idea continued to percolate throughout Honduras, and they kept trying to make it happen, and the legislature just passed this second part of the legislation needed to implement the idea just last week, which is, of course, why Michael Strong can't be here. So they're continuing to move forward, and I'm just going to read this because this is from Michael Strong about sort of what the situation is there. It says, we expect the Honduran government to be ready to authorize the first zones for economic development and employment, which is what they're called, ZEDEs. Within a few months, they'll feature full legal and fiscal autonomy from the Honduran government, we anticipate creating a common law with more economic freedom than Hong Kong and no taxes on income, investment, or transactions. The minimal government functions will be financed through a modest land tax. The legal system will be constrained by international agreements previously made by the Honduran government, including restrictions pertaining to human rights, narcotics trafficking, and money laundering, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But within the boundaries set by those international agreements, our economic zone will be the freest jurisdiction on Earth. So, here's where we sort of get into some of the realities of trying to carve out a place on this planet where we can actually have, a little bit of freedom. Honduras is, of course, in the backyard of the United States. It's a client state. If the United States says, hey, we don't want you running drugs, then, you kind of got to go with that until you get more established. Same thing with, money laundering. I was on the phone this morning with Michael Strong a little bit. I know that some of you are going to ask about this. What about guns? And he said that they are actually going to try and make that something that will be legal. There's, of course, Honduras is currently, like many of the other Central American countries, being racked by drug, gang-related violence. And so they're going to have to think pretty carefully about how they go about implementing that. But they expect that within the city itself, because they will have some level of immigration control as to who goes in and out of the city, that they will be able to have, to allow essentially private citizens of that state to have guns if they want. The legal framework that they're using is going to be separate from that of Honduras. So they're basically going to have their, carte blanche to design their own legal framework. Michael told me that Tom Bell, the libertarian legal scholar who's written quite a bit about polycentric law and libertarian legal systems, is already working on a draft of what some of the legal framework might look like, based partly on Texas commercial law, which is a bit of a compromise because there's a large Honduran community in Texas, so there's a lot of locals there that are familiar with it. Obviously, there's a lot of, for foreign investors who are looking to come in and do some investment. The Texas code is fairly American, and so it's well known and understood. One of the things I want to talk about is the pros and cons, free cities or charter cities initiatives versus something like the Free State Project. Something that if they're successful in breaking ground on this initiative down there, they'll be starting with a blank slate. It's going to be in an undeveloped rural area. There won't be any existing law or existing infrastructure. There will be no people there who are used to doing things a certain way. There will be no existing contracts that would have to be, rewritten or translated or migrated. So, compared to what we've got, for example, here in New Hampshire, it's much easier to start from that blank slate condition. Obviously, they'll have lower taxes. I'm not totally sure what the quote modest land tax is gonna be, but the city as a whole will be organized more. I mean, it's going to be sort of a unique legal entity within Honduran law, but essentially as a corporation of its own, they're going to be paying 15% of net profits that they receive from the land tax up to the Honduran government, and partly that's done. As a payment for letting them try their thing there. Partly it also reinforces to the Honduran government and to the Honduran people that this is a good idea and that it directly benefits them, so that they're less likely to withdraw their support from it later and take it over. So obviously there will be less regulation. They're really thinking about, as far as commercial and contract law, having it be pretty wide open, subject only to those minimum requirements of human rights, narcotics trafficking, and money laundering criteria that are basically a concession to operating within the international community. And one of the other benefits of locating a city in a region like that is, of course, access to cheap labor. Companies that are going to be investing down there and trying to start, manufacturing businesses or technology industries that require, phone operators or something like that. They'll of course have all of the Hondurans down there. There's quite a bit of unemployment down there. Obviously, the educational system probably isn't quite up to snuff yet. But then again, neither was India's 40 years ago, and now look where they are. Cons. Well, number one for this whole project is it's difficult to find a willing host. There was a Free Cities initiative with Madagascar about 5 or 6 years ago that fell through after there was a coup. They kind of got lucky with Honduras that there was a very highly placed minister who was already receptive to the idea and then was exposed to the idea, the fact that there were other academics and entrepreneurs that were thinking about this. So they kind of got lucky there. As far as a longer-term vision to say, let's not just put free cities in Honduras, but let's put free cities in places all around the world, particularly in underdeveloped or developing countries that could really benefit from that sort of external investment and from the upgrading of the rules and reduction of corruption. That's one of the challenges. In this case, they seem to have found a loophole, a good opportunity. Of course, once you find the willing host, then you're continuing to you continue to be dependent on the goodwill of that host nation. So Honduras could at some point change their mind and say, what, thanks for building all of this amazing infrastructure, but we're now going to nationalize it because we're greedy and corrupt. As I said, the 15% profit, tax on profits that the city itself will be paying to the national government should help continue to demonstrate the benefit for that host nation of allowing the city to operate autonomously and without any interference. And of course, there could be a regime change that will threaten that, but who knows? It's worth trying. And of course, sort of much like what the seasidding guys say is, what we need is to have lots of different experiments happening that will try to come up with the right set of laws. So hopefully, the Hondurans will allow there to be more than one city. In fact, they've already carved out a handful of areas of prospective areas where some of these charter cities could break ground. There's a couple of places you could go to find out more if you want to. Brian Doherty over at Reason Magazine has written about this a bunch. He had a big article that was in the same, was in May's edition of Reason that was the same issue that covered the Free State Project. He wrote a big article about the ins and outs of it's actually quite an interesting story about getting this project off the ground in Honduras and all the various setbacks they've had. And he actually also just wrote an update last week when the newest legislation was passed. There was also an NPR podcast, their Planet Money, which I think was also rebroadcast on This American Life, where it was about a 25 minute segment where they were down in Honduras and they were talking to both Paul Romer, who was one of the original academics who sort of came up with and championed the idea, and also with Octavio Sanchez, the Honduran minister who championed the idea within the government. You can check both of those out. So that's sort of where they're at now. In terms of thinking about why this is important, in talking to Michael Strong, one of the things he wanted to emphasize was that the way to think about this isn't as some sort of kooky, peculiar, libertarian, legal or political experiment. The way he wants to promote it is as a technological innovation. That this is an attempt to design a new technology, a legal technology, a political technology, but a technology that will facilitate the creation of wealth. The creation of wealth in places that desperately need it. So it's a mechanism for countries, developing countries, underdeveloped countries, to carve out a place that allows foreign, international investors to come in and feel comfortable and confident, risking their capital to say, yes, we'll come in, we will build buildings, we will start companies, we will build the roads, we will have hospitals, we will have an airport. Obviously being on the coast is nice because you could have a port city. Creating all of that wealth, and then, of course, hiring all of the locals to, help do all of that. Not only does that create a certain amount of wealth for the host nation, for the host country, but also allows us to, assuming there's more than one, to try and experiment to see, which technology, which legal framework does that the best, creates wealth the fastest and with the least amount of risk. And so Michael Strong is promoting this as a technological innovation. And he really wants to, one of the questions that we were talking about is, why does it seem like there aren't as many, technology entrepreneurs who get the libertarian impulse to try and innovate with the technology, the legal technology that we use day in and day out to interact with the world. Just because I see Michael Malice sitting here in front of me, I also want to point out that it's not a bad thing. Michael Strong has in his presentation, which I unfortunately can't show you, but one of the pieces of evidence he gives for this, being an issue is North Korea. And he has a little map of the Korean peninsula at night, and you can see that there's a small little cluster of lights around Pyongyang, and then the entire southern part of the peninsula is just like, you can't see any darkness. It's just all light. And the difference there, of course, it's the same people, it's the same geography, it's the same land, same history up until, I don't know, 100 years ago, 50 years ago. What was different? Nothing more than the legal regime. And if we can figure out how to take all the places in the world, Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, that are currently dark in the map of the night sky, and we can turn them into that bright, shining beacon of civilization and wealth creation, then that's billions of people that we can lift up out of poverty. And if we can do that by through implementation of freedom in the technology of law that we implement, that we live by, then that's victory. That's victory for us. That's victory for everybody. That's all I have to say prepared, but I would definitely like to open it up to any questions. I'll answer them as best I can. Obviously, I'm just filling in. I'm not an expert. But I would also like to encourage a discussion of any kind about, especially about differences between Free State Project and the Free Cities Initiative and seasteading, that sort of thing, pros, cons. Go ahead.
Is it on? Okay.
There you go.
So this city, they've negotiated a contract with the Honduran government. I'm curious, is there like a third-party arbiter, or is the Honduran government also like the arbiter of this agreement Do you know what I mean?
That's a good question. I don't know the official answer. I know that I've heard a couple of different things. The Honduran government is not the final arbiter. I'm not sure if they will be there, if under their common law-ish system, they will have a mechanism for final arbitration internally. I've also heard previous plans, and I don't know whether this is still the case or not, that they had contracted out to, I think it was Canada, to provide Canadians, basically Supreme Court as a basically the Canadian government volunteered themselves as arbiter of last resort. I think with the new version, because they're sort of able to draft it from scratch, that they're going to be doing that internally.
Can you talk, just to be clear, can you talk about some of the laws that kind of we take for granted that will not be on the books there? For example, like discrimination laws, minimum wage, sexual harassment. Are all these things off the table in Honduras?
Yes. The federal code runs to, what is it, 60,000 pages, and a lot of those laws cover all sorts of regulations about how companies operate. They are starting from, because they're starting with common law, the contracts will be voluntary, subject to, basic human rights limitations, as I mentioned, so far as I know, and corporate regulations will essentially, not exist other than to not violate, those basic international law parameters. So far as I know, yes, it will be common law. If a corporation or individual is doing something bad or is getting sued, then they will be creating the whatever the court system is. I don't know if that's going to be explicitly private or court system or not. Of course, one of the benefits would be is if we can get more than one city doing that, we can try different things.
In terms of, because I know an ongoing problem in Hong Kong is, it is a democratic state, and all democratic states tend to erode property and contract rights in support of welfarism, and they're kind of in the beginning stages of that in Hong Kong. Will there be elections in the city? To what extent will they matter? Constitutional referendums, anything along those lines that could erode the common law core that the city's been built on?
That's a really good question. I don't have a definitive answer on that. My understanding is that the city will be set up as a corporation until they get whatever the special legal status under Honduran law is, but that they will then continue to essentially operate as a corporate-like entity. How that corporation is to be managed, I'm not sure. I could certainly imagine, and from my discussion with Michael, my understanding is that it's going to be largely based on who invests there. So because the revenues will be derived from land taxes, that it will be the investors who come in to actually buy the pieces of land that will then be involved in the ongoing governance.
Okay.
But that's not a definitive answer, so.
So this is not quite going to be libertaria. I mean, the legal system will have some things we don't like in it, and I was curious what you think the worst such. I was curious as to what you thought the worst such things might be.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Because it is located in the United States backyard, and the United States is such a aggressive, call it what you want, imperialist, world policeman, whatever. They are going to have in their corporate charter that, or whatever the law is that allows them to operate within Honduras, they will have those constraints of human rights, narcotics trafficking, and money laundering. And
what do you see as the worst thing that will be in the legal system there?
Well, I think probably the biggest risk is that, you could say, okay, well, that's fine, no narcotics trafficking, that's, whatever, that's sort of not such a bad thing. We can work around that as long as we have lots of other freedoms. Same thing with money laundering. I think the risk there is that those laws, like many of the laws we have here in this country, can be abused. They can be used as an excuse to trump up charges or to go on fishing expeditions and say, we don't like what you're doing, whatever it is, and so we're going to accuse you of violating this other law that is just, it's a mala prohibitum, it's just an arbitrary law, and that it'll be difficult to defend against that.
By the way, when I hear no narcotics trafficking, that doesn't just apply to things transiting the special area. That also includes things internally, correct?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Okay.
I would actually assume that that because it's specifically trafficking, that they would be more concerned about transiting or exported from, and that internally within, certainly they would have no enforcement mechanism for dealing with that. If it was just for private use or anything like that, I would assume. I don't know.
For individuals that are interested in moving to this city, what would be the sort of equivalent to permanent residency, citizenship, in terms of rights to live and work there?
That's a great question. So the immigration situation is that they want to obviously encourage foreign investment. And they also want to encourage local employment. They want to try and, Honduras wants to try and keep it for Honduras as much as they can. So that, for example, they're trying to figure out a way to allow Hondurans to work there and not, say, Guatemalans. So one of the things that they'll probably do there is they'll have, obviously local Hondurans can sort of come and go as they please, subject to security considerations. Foreign nationals, there may be something like a $10,000 minimum investment or a $10,000 escrow fee, just to clear sort of a minimal financial hurdle, so that you're not getting other poor Latin Americans trying to sneak in there, so that Honduras, which is taking the risk and giving, basically essentially donating the land, is actually getting the benefit for their citizens of the wealth creation that's happening in that city. Does that answer your question?
On the subject of international law, it seems to me like international law will almost be the law of the land here. Honduran federal law won't apply, but they had to slither in whatever international law.
Speak a little closer.
Whatever international law agreements the Honduran government had signed will also apply in this zone. At least that's the impression I got from your talk. Do you worry about this also being an issue with even seasteading, where there will be a general push for seasteads to follow international law, and certainly with other charter cities, will international law be possibly even more strictly enforced than it is in the current nation states?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think that the interesting thing about international law is that it is in many ways, it is anarchy. It is an anarchic law, because there is no super legal regime that governs, that governs countries, that governs economic activity between two countries. Sure, there's UN and there's all sorts of other, agreements, both bilateral and multilateral, but those are essentially just contracts. And those contracts can be violated. And if those contracts are violated, there are some arbitration mechanisms, but ultimately, if one country just doesn't want to do it, they don't have to. So for both seasteading, and potential seasteads, and for free cities, sure, they will be subject in as much as countries are subject to international law. But really all that means is that, they will be voluntarily participating in supranational legal regimes, for example, for international banking and finance, there's the SWIFT system that basically governs, and there's dozens or hundreds of those things that cover all different kinds of economic activity, telecommunications and banking and travel and what have you. So I would assume that, that city essentially as an independent national entity would voluntarily participate in the international standards and best practices that they want to, in order to be able to do business with other countries who essentially require that in order for their citizens and their corporations to be able to do business with that country. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, I think so.
Hi. Given the obvious economic advantage, you mentioned places like Hong Kong.
Closer.
Given the obvious economic advantages, you mentioned places like Hong Kong and even the Koreas. Is the objection to setting these up mostly political? They don't want. Is it either local countries or other regimes don't want to lose the power that all this economic freedom is gonna create?
That's a good question. My understanding is that a lot of the objection to, internally from the host nation, Honduras, for example, comes from a fear that it's some sort of globalization, multinational corporation profit, resource raping. And to be fair, they maybe haven't had the best experience dealing with, companies like, Chevron and, companies like that. Mining companies, resource extraction companies. So they're a little bit afraid that it sort of like smacks of some sort of neo-colonialism where, these foreign companies are going to come in, they're going to rape and pillage and steal, and then, the locals aren't going to get any benefit from that. So I think that there's a bit of reluctance or fear on that score. That said, there was one of the journalists that I was reading about, was interviewing sort of man on the street style interviews with Hondurans to say, hey, have you heard of this? What do you think about it? And almost universally they were like, why are you asking me? My opinion doesn't matter. It's going to happen or not happen anyway based on what the political elites and the financial elites are going to decide anyway. So I think that, this is one of those cases where if we can just, by hook or by crook, get it up and running and demonstrate the actual benefit, then we can use that, to say, hey, look, this actually works, and, let's try it in other places as well.
Do you know anything about the legal tender? Or is there going to be any legal tender, and how does it interact with money laundering laws, and, any comment on that?
That's a great question. I don't know what legal tender they're going to use. I assume they're probably going to use the dollar or something like that.
And is there any hope that they just won't have a legal tender?
Sure, there's a hope. Bitcoin could make that question moot. I mean,
even in the absence of Bitcoin, you can use other currencies, euros, dollars, and you can. In principle, people could use whatever they choose.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably the only risk is that you would run into some, some of the money international money laundering rules that constraints that will be put in place, at the behest of largely the United States, could curtail some of that. But as far as the rest of the legal regime, yeah, I don't see why they couldn't set it up so that there could be currency competition.
So is there literally no one living in this zone? Because as a libertarian, we'd hate to be in favor of eminent domain. And
right.
I know often corporations have used what you could call eminent domain to remove tribal villagers, and such. This is literally just an unpopulated zone. If there are people there, are they going to be kicked off? Are their property rights going to be respected at all? And
right.
so on.
So there are essentially two different mechanisms for doing that. One is completely uninhabited territories. And there's a couple of areas in Honduras that have been identified as potential sites for these cities. There is another mechanism, however, whereby a very rural community, we're talking about sort of villages or towns at the largest, can essentially have a referendum to say, hey, do we want to propose ourselves as one of these sites because either we see the benefit of it or because there's nothing else going on, so that there's a small jump start in the amount of infrastructure, and people already living there, et cetera, instead of having to put out the call to say, hey, we're miles away from anything else. Can you come work here? And having that be an impediment to getting local, local workers to come and help out. So there's two mechanisms for that. I don't know exactly what the details are of that referendum whereby an existing community can volunteer. I assume it's more or less democratic.
Hey man, do you have any plans of limiting who can invest? I mean, it could be that all the drug lords in the world find this to be a good place to have the equivalent of a citizenship, and you'd have a PR problem.
That's a great question. Other than the imposed constraints on both money laundering and narcotics trafficking, I don't know if they will have some sort of vetting or filtering process. I do know that for some of the other economic citizenship programs that are implemented by St. Kitts and Nevis or Dominica, or even some of the bigger ones like Austria, Canada, Australia, those guys, that when you're basically applying for citizenship there, you have to submit quite a bit of documentation, including things like last 10 years records for residential employment and local, police reports from both local and federal authorities, verifying that you're in fact clean, fingerprints, letters of recommendation from banks and other professionals, et cetera, et cetera. So they could implement some sort of process of that, whereby they have some minimum criteria to meet for foreigners coming in. I mean, there's no reason why they wouldn't also do that for the locals that are coming in too. I don't know, but that's a good question. Yeah, that's definitely a challenge that any nascent startup city is going to have to wrestle with, especially in that area of the world.
Hi, I came a little bit late, so if you've already covered this, I withdraw my question. Have you heard of the law-free community in Colombia, Gaviotas? And has there been any communication between those people? How does it possibly relate to Gaviotas?
The law-free community of what?
In Colombia, in the country of Colombia, there's...
I haven't heard of it, obviously.
Okay. There was a bunch of engineers and brainy people just went to an uninhabited area of Colombia, and they started a community with no laws, and they're just doing their thing, just free market there.
I have not heard of that, but that's interesting. I'll have to check that out.
Okay.
Hi, I'd like to ask about the topography that you guys are looking at, or
Typography or topography?
topography. Yeah, like it's ground soil, and are there any different kinds of resources that you're looking to build it on, like next to a river, anything like that?
So
cool?
Once again, I'm actually not in any official capacity related to this project. But from what I've read and from my conversation with Michael Strong, there is obviously always a benefit to being near the water, which is one of the reasons why New Hampshire got a couple of points for having short but having a coastline, because you always want to be able to have access to import and export goods and services without having to transit through any other legal regime. You want to have direct access to the sea. And there are several of the sites in Honduras that have been proposed for these cities that are on the water. There are others that are landlocked. As far as soil composition and stuff like that, my expectation would be that they are not going after agriculture. It's not dense enough. They would be probably importing food and stuff like that from the surrounding community. Or if they're, they have a port, then, obviously, or an airport, I suppose, internationally. But that agriculture wouldn't be their primary focus. It would be more like, high-tech jobs, manufacturing, that sort of thing. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much. I encourage everyone to go and check it out on their own. And once again, apologies that Michael Strong couldn't be here himself, but obviously he seems to be making good progress down there. So, thank you.
I picked up an angel whose left wing was broken. I sewed him together with some string and a vision. He raised his right hand and he gave me an answer. My mouth opened wide and I asked many questions. I see crowds of people all gathered around me. They all want the truth, but they don't want to hear it. I fear they will rob me if I dare to speak it. But poverty bears the fruit.